So you've been hearing people talk about Stims, but you're still trying to figure out what exactly are they? Well, don't worry. In this video, we're going to talk about what Stims are, some common types of Stims, and even touch on why autistic people do it. Are you ready? Let's dive in. So the word STEM is actually an abbreviation. It's short for self-stimulatory behaviors. In other words, self-stimulation. Out in the medical field, instead of self-stimulatory behavior, you'll often hear STEMs referred to as stereotypic behavior or as motor stereotypies. No matter what term you use, they all describe the same thing. So let's break down exactly what this means. Simply put, STEMs are the repetitive movements or sounds that autistic people engage in. The key word here is repetitive. Now, I said autistic people engage in them because one of the characteristics of autism is repetitive movements. However, it's important to mention that everyone actually stims to some degree. That means that even people who aren't autistic or who don't have any neurodevelopmental conditions can also stim. For example, if you've ever shaken your legs repetitively or twirled your hair over and over or paced back and forth anxiously, then you are stimming. The difference for autistic people then is usually seen in how often we stim, the intensity of our stims, the kinds of stims that we engage in, or our inability to stop stimming when it's inappropriate to do so. So I mentioned that the kinds of stims that autistic people engage in may look different than that of neurotypical people or the general population. So let's talk about that a little bit more. But first, for those who don't know, my name is Alethea. I'm a late diagnosed autistic helping others understand and accept autism. So if you want to learn more about how to support your autistic loved ones, or if you yourself need support on your autistic journey, then consider subscribing. But back to the common types of STEMs that can be found in autism. So generally speaking, STEMs can be classified in a few different categories, such as physical, auditory, visual, tactile, oral, and olfactory. These categories relate to a person's 5 senses, like your sense of taste, touch, smell, hearing, and sight. We're only going to briefly cover these categories in this video, which is meant to be more of an overview of stimming, but check out the links in the description because I've made a detailed video on each of the topics that we discuss here. So in the autism spectrum, physical stimming would look like moving the body, such as hand flapping, jumping, or rocking. Auditory stims, as you might guess, have to do with sounds. This category can actually be further broken down into verbal stims, which involve creating words, or vocal stims, which is creating noises and sounds that don't actually make words. An example of auditory stimming would be a person repeating a word or a phrase over and over and over and over. Oral stims also involve the mouth, but not for the functions of speech or making noise. Oral stimming includes things like finger sucking, biting others, or chewing on objects like pencils and clothing. Somewhat similarly, olfactory stims involve taste and smell. So this might look like sniffing someone's hair or licking foreign objects. Visual stimming, of course, involves the eyes. And one of the most common examples of visual stimming that you'll hear in autism is that of a child being described as watching the wheels of a toy car spin instead of actually rolling and playing with the car as a whole. But visual stims can also include staring at lights or being fascinated and staring at moving objects like flowing water. Lastly, tactile stims refer to the sensations of touch and feeling. This could look like skin picking or hair pulling or just touching and rubbing textured surfaces repeatedly. I'd love to hear from you. Do you or your loved one have a favorite stim? If so, comment down below. So for me, I engage in every category of stimming. By far though, tactile stimming is the stim that I find myself doing the most. Like when I say I rub and touch on all the fabrics and it's everything for me. And when I say it's what I find myself doing, I mean that oftentimes I don't even realize that I'm doing it. Now that I've been diagnosed and I know that I'm autistic, I do try to allow myself time intentionally to stim, but majority, very, very, very vast majority of the time, I don't even realize that I'm stimming. It's just an ingrained thing. Because tactile stimming is my go-to, it involves my hands. So sometimes, of course, I have to drive, and I actually eat while I drive, breakfast time especially, almost every single morning. And so sometimes it's really hard, and I have learned how to adapt my stims to the situation where, you know, I'm eating, so I can't really stim, but I'm driving, so I can't really stim, but I can like take a finger and rub it on the other finger to get something. So that's kind of what I've been doing. Interestingly though, if you had asked me 20 years ago what my top STEM categories were, and if I had actually known that I was autistic back then, I would have told you oral and tactile stimming, both of those equally. So in the oral category, from chewing on clothes to biting people in the butt, apparently, to chewing on pencils, juice boxes, thumb sucking. Yes, oral fixations were very real for me. Like, you remember that one character from Charlie Brown? Like the one that was always sucking his thumb and carrying around the blanket? Yeah, that was me. That was me. So all of that to say, autism is a spectrum. And so how autistic traits present themselves can look different for each person, right? Therefore, how autistic people stim can vary. The types of stims that they do, it can vary from person to person, but also the types of stims that one particular person engages in can also change over the course of their lifetime. So now that you know what stims are and what they might look like, your next question may be, why do autistic people do it? Well, remember that STIM is short for self-stimulatory behavior or self-stimulation. So that gives you a little bit of a clue as to why we do it, but it's not quite the full picture. So let's talk about it. So as the name kind of suggests, some of the reasons why we may stim are that we are seeking stimulation from our environment. Maybe we are understimulated because of the differences in our brains and the wiring of it and how that relates to our sensory processing, how we process the things from our five senses. Or, so it could be seeking stimulation, or it could be one of the ways that we express something is wrong. We're distressed, but also it could be just expressing the stimulation that we've already received from our environment, right? So again, either we're understimulated and we're trying to stimulate ourselves, or we've received stimulation and we need to process it. So for me, that feels like energy, or I kind of like to say it as you're letting the wiggles out. It feels like all of your emotions are really big right? So when I'm happy, I feel really happy. When I'm excited, I'm really excited. When I'm anxious, I'm really anxious. Like all of the emotions and feelings are exaggerated and big and quite frankly, overwhelming sometimes. And so that's really where that difference comes in autism and how we process that. If you think of the body as like a filter, like an air filter, where the air comes in and the filter does its thing and the air comes out. So we've got these big sensory inputs, these big emotions coming in, and then our body is like trying to process it. And due to the differences in our brain, it processes it a little differently. And so sometimes that energy comes out and expresses itself as these stims. So again, stimming can be a form of emotional regulation, right? Instead of saying, I'm happy, may rock and hum to express that happiness. On top of emotional expression and sensory regulation that we talked about, really you can think of stimming also as a calming mechanism, something that is used during those stressful times or during anxious times to help relieve some of that anxiety. So you know a little bit more about what stims are and why we do it, but let's talk about some of the misconceptions and what stims are not. One common misconception is that stimming is always harmful and that it should be stopped. The truth is, this is actually a gray area. Some stims can potentially cause injury, but overall, stimming does more good than harm. So for instance, sometimes even in something that seems so innocent and harmless, like rubbing fabrics, right? The fabrics are soft, so you think, there's nothing wrong with that. But there are some days where my anxiety is so high that I am rubbing on fabric all day, literally all day, to the point where the pads of my fingers become raw and they hurt. Like, can't scroll, can't use the touchpad on my computer. I mean, I can, but it hurts to do so. It's painful to do so. And so that's where the benefit versus the harm. And interestingly, even in those times, like my default is to stim, and my default stim is touching the fabric. And so there's still some kind of benefit that's happening, even though I've kind of overdone it accidentally, right? And that's where that saying comes from, too much of any good thing can be a bad thing. But even in cases like this, or more extreme cases, never stop an autistic person from stimming. It's just helpful to redirect the type of stimming that they're doing. We just went through all these many different categories. Those are just the categories. And within each category, there are a lot more types. And so there are many options. So even if a person's go-to stim, their default stim is one thing, you can just redirect them to a different stim, but don't completely try to force them to stop stimming, or it will harm them mentally instead of physically. Myth number 2 is that stimming always means that a person is stressed or anxious. And this is not true at all. This is actually one of the ways that people get misdiagnosed or get swept under the rug and don't actually get recognized until later on in life, because they get diagnosed with something like depression with anxiety, when actually it's perhaps autistic burnout and increased stimming. And so it's important to understand that stimming doesn't always mean I'm anxious, I'm distressed. Sometimes, yes, it very much does. And this is where it's important to learn that particular autistic person, and remembering that autism is a spectrum, and so people present different things in different ways. So for one person, rocking may always be their go-to default stim for anxiety, or rocking may be something they do when they're anxious and when they're happy. So if you see an autistic person rocking, you can't automatically assume that they're anxious and distressed, because stimming happens again when we're happy, when we're excited, but also even just when we're trying to focus. We can stim to help us focus. So I guess a part of this myth is that stimming, if we're stimming, that means we're not listening or we're being rude, and that's actually not the case. So while understanding autism and stimming is very important, accepting them is the next step. We can do this by first learning to respect stimming for what it is. Stimming is just a natural process for autistic people. It is natural and it is necessary. Next, avoid giving into or spreading misinformation about stimming. You can actually take this step a little further by correcting other people when you hear them spreading negative stigma and misinformation. So not only can you make a difference by controlling your own actions and watching out for bias and negative stigma, you can help even further by inserting yourself when it's appropriate and correcting other people. Another important thing we can do is help create a safe space for autistic people to stim without ridicule or judgment. So if you're at the grocery store and you see an autistic child or adult stimming or engaging in any other autistic trait or behavior, be respectful. Don't take out your phone to record. Don't make negative comments. Don't stare, right? Just let the person be. When we're stimming, we're trying to just be free to be ourselves and navigate this world that is often overwhelming, whether it's the social side and or the sensory processing side. You know, we're just trying to get through. We're just trying to live life. And so we are not a spectacle. We're not a circus performance. So please don't treat us as such. Accepting autism, and specifically accepting stimming, really boils down to being patient with autistic people and allowing us the time and the space that we need to self-regulate. If you want to learn more about stimming and other autistic traits, be sure to click right here.